Welcome back to the Stick Figure Historian channel, guys. In our last episode, we talked about the Royalist defeat at the Battle of Naseby. And, well, many things were left behind by the Royalists on the battlefield. Money, food, armor, and weapons. But perhaps the most valuable thing, to Parliament at least, were King Charles' personal papers. Pawing through these documents, the Roundheads found further confirmation of the king's dealings with the Catholics in Ireland. And even worse, proof of his hopes and dreams to unite with other Catholic leaders in Europe. The papers showing these things were publicly published in London, under the title of The King's Cabinet Opened. Needless to say, if there was any love left for the king among the staunch Puritans and Protestants, this was a serious blow to their affections. As for Fairfax and the new model army, they had entered their glory day. Leicester was back in their control, and they now returned to the former business of rescuing Taunton from the Royalists in the west. This too was easily done, and by July, Fairfax had rent nearly the entire west of England from the hands of Lord Goring at the Battle of Langport. Their next destination? Bristol. It was Rupert who would bear the brunt of this new attack. As the victor over this hard-won strategic town, he had been made governor by the king, and had just been sent there after the Battle of Naseby to guard it. But just as Bristol had been hard to take, it was proving equally difficult to guard. Plague was raging among the people within the walls. Supplies were short, the defenses less than optimal. Notwithstanding, Rupert was determined to do his duty. For 18 days the Roundheads were kept without the outer set of walls, but when the men guarding these were slaughtered and driven within the inner walls, the situation became impossible. The inner walls were in no shape to withstand serious attack. Rupert surrendered the town on decent terms. He and his men were escorted to Oxford and allowed to keep their freedom. Charles was rather upset when he learned of Bristol's fate. He had been planning to use it as a base for recruits from Wales, and he had even been considering moving his capital there at some point. He took his frustration out on Rupert, the only logical place he could find to pin the blame. "You assured me you would keep Bristol for 4 months," the king wrote. "Did you keep it 4 days?" He then promptly added injury to the insult by taking away Rupert's position as general of horse. Now, up to this point, the king and his nephew had not been on the best of terms. Rupert had been pressing Charles to make peace since Naseby, something the king found rather irritating. And to make matters worse, Lord Digby was doing everything in his power to make Rupert look bad. Rupert and Digby were men with very opposite personalities. Perhaps the only thing they had in common was their hatred for each other. And with the prince gone fighting, that meant Digby had the king's ear all to himself. And as one of the king's favorites, Charles paid him quite a bit of heed. Thus, tensions had been steadily mounting between the king and Rupert. But this last comment Charles had made, and the taking away of his generalship, was more than Rupert could bear. He snapped. Taking his brother Maurice with him, he mounted a little troop of horse and set his sights on Newark, where the king was stationed at the time. Endless hills, moors, and roads passed beneath the horse's hooves as Rupert sped over the 100 miles between Oxford and Newark. He was taking a huge risk crossing through Roundhead-held territory, but none of that mattered to him. His rage spurred him onward and overshadowed all the dangers of the journey. Charles heard he was coming, and began to fear his nephew was planning to overthrow him. He sent orders for Rupert to cease immediately, but not even this could stop him. Richard Willis, the governor of Newark, and an old-time friend of Rupert's, saw the prince approaching and rode out to meet him. Rupert demanded immediate entrance to speak with the king. This was a bit of a tricky spot for Richard. Here he was trapped between the will of the king, who he knew did not very much want to speak with Rupert at the moment, and the will of Rupert, who was not an easy man to cross. He decided to side with his friend, and allowed Rupert passage into the city. Very soon, Charles must have felt as if someone had unleashed an angry lion into his court. Rupert was fuming. He demanded that a proper trial be held regarding his conduct at Bristol, and that if Charles was going to indeed fire him, that he do it on honorable terms. Maurice spoke afterwards, defending his brother as a witness. Charles, apparently cowed by this sudden outburst, gave in. Rupert's honor was restored in a formal military trial. It was only reluctantly that the king agreed to Rupert's demands, and he was really feeling quite sour about the whole ordeal. And, as is often the case with selfish people, he was looking for someone to blame his misfortunes on other than himself. He began to think of how this had happened, and decided it was Richard's fault. Yes, that was it. Richard had let Rupert into the city without his permission. How dare he? He took away Richard's position as governor of Newark and appointed another man, John Belazes, in his stead. Now it was Richard's turn to be angry. He went straight to John and challenged him to a duel, a common practice in those days for men who felt their honor slighted. Charles forbade the two to fight, but it only made ill feelings fester. Rupert, Maurice, and several other officers stood up in defense of their friend, and began to demand that Charles give Richard his governorship back. A nasty argument followed. It's generally an unadvisable thing to argue with a king, and so it proved in this case. Charles snapped and dismissed every one of them from their army positions. The estranged prince and his angry companions galloped off to spend the winter in Woodstock. At this point, they were seriously considering leaving England. Venice was in need of good soldiers. Perhaps they could be of service there, where they would actually be appreciated.